Today, we are so excited to have the opportunity to talk to you for today's webinar, which is a refresher for instructors reinforcing the basics and avoiding ghost and zombie guidelines. So we know that some of you may find APA style a bit scary, but we're here to refresh your memory on APA style guidelines and provide some really good tips and tricks to battle zombie and ghost guidelines, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We also will put in any links in the chat, and as Devin mentioned, we are going to send you everything you need Monday morning in an email, so you don't have to worry about catching all of those links. Next slide, please. My name is Samantha Denny, and I'm here with my colleagues, Chelsea Lee, the instructional lead for APA Style, and Tim McAdoo, a manager for APA Style. We're all members of the APA Style team, which is the team responsible for creating, updating, promoting, and teaching APA Style guidelines. Next slide, please. As you can see, we have a really large group today from all over the world, which is fantastic, as you can see in the chat. I'm sure we have APA Style experts who are listening in, as well as those who might not be as familiar with APA Style. So today, we're going to start with some basics of teaching APA Style, then move to some more advanced topics. So hopefully this should be great for anyone listening, no matter what your experience level is, no matter what subject you teach. This should hopefully be useful to everyone. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with some basics. We hope you've had a few years now to dig into the 7th edition of APA Style, but we have seen a lot of misconceptions over the years about APA Style guidelines. So we're going to share some information about changes from earlier editions, then dive into our zombie and ghost guidelines. Answering thousands of questions throughout the years from students, teachers, editors, researchers, and more, we've come across a number of misconceptions of APA Style that we're going to combat today. We'll talk about outdated APA guidelines that keep rising from the dead, which are our zombie guidelines. And then we'll debunk some APA Style myths, which we're calling ghost guidelines, just in time for Halloween. We'll finish up with our best weapons to fight scary guidelines, which is authoritative APA Style resources. We hope to have time for questions at the end, so go ahead, use that Q&A feature for your questions as we go along. And you can use the chat to share your comments, to chat amongst yourselves, and we'll also be putting some links in there if you want some more information. So let's start with a quick refresher on the basics of teaching APA Style. We often hear that those new to APA Style believe that APA Style is just references, but really APA Style is much more than that. If you're new to APA Style, or if you're introducing students to APA Style for the first time, we recommend starting with our 3 style starters, which are topics that provide a solid foundation in APA Style. These are paper format, references, and inclusive language. You can find a summary of these 3 style starters on our APA Style tip sheet, which is available on our website in the handouts and guides section, and we'll also pop that in the chat for you. The first style starter is paper format. Paper format has to do with how a paper looks. Obviously, you want your students to create papers that look professional, and an overarching goal with format is for it to be consistent. To that end, we recommend that for many of the details of format, you rely on your word processing software. So maybe you use Microsoft Word, Google Docs, something like that. And those systems really do a lot of the work for you. Many of the default settings are consistent with APA Style, such as the default font and margin settings. Other settings can be globally applied, so things like heading styles, page numbers, and line spacing. You can also use built-in tools to create things like bulleted lists, the hanging indent and references, and tables and figures. So by using the word processing tools in order to help you format these things, it's easy, it creates a consistent look, and if people are reading your paper on a computer, the papers are more accessible as well. So with paper format, it's good to remember that the most basic APA style paper is going to include 3 sections: the title page, the text, and the reference list. On our website, in the instructional aid section, we have a couple of different student paper checklists, some of which were just created, that are going to help students get paper format and content right. So for a beginner's audience, we recommend the beginner's version of the checklist. And for students who are writing papers with more elements, there are other versions of the checklist that covers things like tables and figures. So this can be a really great way just to make sure you have all your bases covered in terms of your formatting. The second style starter is references. At a basic level, to create a reference, students must ask the following questions about their sources. They're looking for author, date, title, and source. So we know that there are many different specific reference types that a student might be using, but at their core, all references are really going to come down to these 4 questions. The questions being, who is responsible for this work? When was this work published? What is this work called? And where can I retrieve this work? So helping your students to remember author, date, title, source is really helpful for them. And we've been playing around with some fun mnemonic devices. So we have the Halloween themed Autumn Days Turn Spooky. My golden retriever inspired me to All Dogs Take Socks. So if you have any good ideas, you can go ahead and pop them in the chat. A Day to Shine is another one. So we really hope that even though we know that references can be a bit complex, that you can help your students to remember author, date, title, source. So, of course, each reference type, as I mentioned, does have a specific format. And for that, we recommend following reference examples. So it's impossible to memorize every specific scenario, which is why we recommend keeping your publication manual nearby, of course. And we also have tons of free help available on our website. Here you can see a screenshot of our reference examples page, which Tim can put in the chat, which has hundreds of examples organized by type. So things like journal articles, books, social media, etc. We also have many different handouts and guides available, such as the APA style reference guide to journal articles, books, and edited book chapters that shows the 4 parts of a reference. Again, author, date, title, source. And you can see that one right in the middle of the screen. So you can see we color coded it by the different parts of the reference. And that's going to list all the common reference examples in one place. Furthermore, all the examples show the corresponding in-text citations, so you have all the components you need. And we're often asked about automatic citation tools and reference managers. So people will ask us, is it okay if, we go online and use this citation creator or that one? And many of these are really fantastic ways to keep track of your research and get a head start on your reference list. But we do know, and you guys have told us as well, that there are some mistakes sometimes in these tools. So sometimes they make mistakes in APA style. So knowing the basics of how to format a reference and follow a reference example is going to give students, instructors, researchers, really people of all levels, the knowledge they need to spot check their work and avoid mistakes from just trusting the tools. So as you know, the important aspects of references to reinforce are that they're going to keep you from plagiarizing, and they help readers find and identify the works that you used in your paper. We want to emphasize that the information that you use in a reference should be evident to both you and potential readers. It's usually on the title page or first page, or prominently shown on a website. Don't dig through website source code and things like that, trying to find reference details that aren't, apparent, because readers aren't going to do this. The information in your reference should correspond to what readers will actually see if they visit the reference. Remember, identifying the reference is more important than the rigidity of format. If information is missing, we have guidelines for that. For example, if there's a missing date, use ND instead in the reference and in-text citation, which stands for no date. Or if a journal article doesn't have an issue number, simply omit it. We sometimes refer to this advice as cite what's there. Our last style starter is to use inclusive language. We're not going to delve into this in great detail today, but we have lots of resources that do. First, I want to note that while every writing style provides guidance on things like paper format and references, citations, and word choices, APA style is unique in the amount of information and guidance it provides regarding inclusive language use. We use the psychological science conducted by researchers with real people, much of which is published in APA journals, to form the foundation of the guidance. So you know that the advice comes from experience and is backed by science. Both the bias-free language guidelines, which are published as a chapter in the publication manual and free on our site, and the inclusive language guide, which is also free on the APA site, include lengthy reference lists to support the guidance they provide. So here we see a new handout on this slide, and that's a brief guide to bias-free and inclusive language. It summarizes our advice, and it's really a fantastic handout to provide to your students. Okay, so for all of these style starters and APA style in general, we want to remind you that APA style guidelines are secondary to your class and institutional needs. There are often hyper-local needs, such as, maybe a different type of formatting needed for a dissertation. And the guidelines from your school are the ones you should follow. You're the people on the ground actually using the style. So you know what you need. And if you need to adapt things, we support that. For example, we've heard from teachers that like their students to use the professional paper template or include a running head in their paper, even though it's not really required for student papers anymore. So if you have your own preferences with regard to APA style that you want your students to follow, go for it. If it makes sense for you and your students, that's what you should be doing. Now we're going to cover some of the differences between editions of APA style. To begin, here is a history of our APA style manuals. You might be seeing the first ever manual that you use. So if anybody wants to pop in the chat, what was your first manual that you used? Go ahead and do that. So you can see here that we generally have a new edition really every 7 to 10 years. So they're not coming out super frequently, but when we have important information that we want to change, that's when we'll release a new edition. So next slide, please. If you spent a lot of time with a prior edition of the APA style manual and you'd like a quick update on what has changed in the 7th edition, we have help for you on our website. Some of the primary changes include an emphasis on student writing, including types of student papers, student paper title pages, a simplified heading structure. We fully endorse the use of singular they, one space at the end of a sentence, table and figure formats, simplified in-text citations, and more. So to see everything that's changed from the 6th edition, you can go to our instructional aid section on our website, and it's going to talk about the differences between the 6th and 7th edition. So you can place in the chat that instructional aid for you. So you might wonder, why change APA style? We know whenever we make changes, there's a variety of opinions from people who fully endorse it and are super excited to those who maybe missed some elements of prior styles. We make these changes, and not very often, for a couple of reasons. Some of those reasons are in response from feedback from the community of users around the world. People tell us what they like and don't like and what they need. We also respond to changes in technology, such as social media and AI, like ChatGPT. And above all, we're trying to make your life easier. We know no one wants to get bogged down in nitpicky details. So if you have feedback for us, we are always listening. So if you ever want to respond to something we put on social media, or send us an email at styleexpert@apa.org, we're always cataloging this kind of information, and all of it really does go into any kind of changes we make and guidance that we have regarding APA style. So I'm going to hand it over to Tim, who's going to talk about zombie guidelines.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Samantha. I'm going to talk about zombie guidelines, but before I do, I thought I should probably define what that means. We've already talked about it a little bit, but so we often get questions about APA style from students and instructors, and sometimes they're based on older guidelines from editions that are outdated. So Samantha just talked about reasons why guidelines change over time, with the times. And in the next few slides, I'm going to show some of these zombie guidelines, things that were true in the 6th edition or even earlier editions, but that are not applied in 7th edition APA style today. And I'll give a little detail about why that is, in some cases without really getting too detailed, because the important thing is what the current guidelines are. So these zombie guidelines we're going to talk about are things that we hope instructors are not asking students to follow anymore. So first zombie guideline is participants versus subjects. So either term is okay to refer to people in your research, or if you're writing about people that were in other studies. Subjects was once thought to be too impersonal, but readers see both terms now, and participants may be slightly more common, but there's not a rule in the publication manual or in APA style guidelines that says that the word subjects must be avoided. In fact, you have terms like within subjects and between subjects that are used to discuss research designs, and that's very common. I have seen people change that to within participant study design. That's okay, but people familiar with it are just more familiar with within subjects and between subjects, and that's okay. So the last edition of the publication manual, where the guideline suggesting not to use subjects was in the 5th edition, and from the 6th and the 7th, which is where we are now, there's no guideline in APA style against using the word subjects to describe people. But it is worth noting that the bias-free language guidelines within the publication manual do include a section about how to talk about people who participated in your research. So participants is okay, subjects is okay, but so are more descriptive terms like college students or respondents. Is something that identifies the people that actually participated in your study, whatever fits the research you've done. So that's encouraged, but other terms like subjects and participants are also just fine. And Samantha can put a link in the chat to that section of the bias-free language guidelines. So the next zombie guideline is about special rules for numbers in the abstract. So in earlier editions, to save space in the abstracts, which are short, APA style guidelines recommended that authors use numerals for any number at all that appear, just to keep things shorter. That did save space, but it meant that authors had to remember sort of one set of rules for the abstract and another set of rules for if a number is somewhere else. But now abstracts can be longer in some cases. They're more easily found online in a variety of places. And so because that space limitation isn't the thing that it once was, and to make the guidelines easier to follow, in 7th edition APA style, if you see a number in the abstract, deciding whether to spell it out or to use the numeral follows the same guidelines that it would be if you saw that same number in the text of the paper. So that is, if you're writing an abstract, you don't need to follow one set of rules for numbers that are there. And if you need to know what those general guidelines are for numbers, no matter where they appear in the paper, we do have a free numbers and statistics guide handout. That's a good place to start, and we can put that in the chat. Next zombie is retrieved from before URLs. I really like this one. So in older editions, when the internet was young and APA style references had the words retrieved from before the URLs, and you can see that sort of cross through in this example. This was dropped in the 7th edition because it's not really helping anyone to say it was retrieved from. Everyone knows kind of how a link works. So you don't have to put that term in that phrase in every reference, which also saves about, I think it's 15 characters in every reference, which does add up. So it saves some space in your references. And just to note that I talk about URLs and links and also DOIs. You can see in this example, DOI is formatted just like any other link, so that's true for DOIs as well. So the takeaway here is do not need to include retrieved from. And the same is true for retrieval dates. Including the date that you retrieved an online work on the internet was once part of some references. I think this was mostly in 5th edition. 4th was too early, and by 6th, again, people sort of understood how the internet was working. So in 7th edition, the current style, the retrieval dates is almost never needed in a reference. So most web pages, when you're citing them, you can just put the URL at the end. We do recommend adding it in one specific scenario. It's outlined in that first set of bullets. That is when the contents of a page are designed to change over time, but they're not archived. So you have a website that is specifically going to have updates, like it's reporting COVID data on a daily basis or election results over the course of a week. And a website like that also doesn't have a permalink for each change. So that second part of the guideline is important because things like Wikipedia, obviously everyone knows it's designed to change, but it also has an archive. So you still don't need to say I retrieved this on October 18th because the URL, you can put in the URL that gives the reader that and shows them exactly how it looked at that time. So you very rarely need to include the retrieval date. And one common misperception about citing websites is that anytime, or web pages, is that anytime that they are not dated, you need to include the retrieval date, but that's also not the case. So lots of websites are not dated, and you just need to include end period, D period in the usual place in the reference where you would have a year, and that is enough. So we do have examples on the website of this basic guideline that you can find the principles, and then also of your average web page reference, and then also the rare case where retrieval date is needed. There'll be a link for an example of that as well. This is another fun one because it's so straightforward and makes just perfect sense to me. So for a very long time, since really I looked this up from the very first edition in the 1929 article introducing APA style guidelines, the location of the publisher when you were citing a book was required. It was part of the reference. And it made sense in 1929, and it was, I'm sure, very helpful to readers. But more currently, people were finding it confusing if there were multiple locations, or difficult if there was no location included, and also just feeling like it was research and time and effort that was going into putting a piece of the reference that wasn't helping it really. So with 7th edition APA style references, the location is not needed. And there is a fantastic blog post about that with examples we could put in the chat. Okay, next zombie is that only page numbers can be in direct quotation citations. So when quoting directly in your citation, you do always provide the author, the year, and the page number for a quotation. True, but again, that was starting with the first edition of the publication manual. And that was true through several early editions of the manual where the sources were primarily journal articles that had pages and books that had pages, dissertations and other standard kind of works. But these days, of course, people are citing all of those things, but also web pages that are not numbered and ebooks sometimes that are not numbered, and things that aren't even text, like YouTube videos and podcasts. So first, if you're quoting from a source that doesn't have a page number, obviously you cannot include the page number, and that's okay. You can include a paragraph number or the section name, or both. There's a section and the third paragraph in that section. Or also for videos, we recommend including the timestamp. That would be true for podcasts as well. That would be the timestamp where the quote that you're quoting begins. So the zombie guideline here is that only page numbers are acceptable, whereas the actual current guideline is that lots of other kinds of locations in the citation are just as valid as a page number. And the goal to keep in mind is that it's helping your reader find that direct quote. So even for something that's text-based, it's true that a reader might have an online copy that they can just copy and paste into the find and find that quote, and that's great. But they may print it, they may take it on the train with them, they may be using a screen reader or other technologies to read the work, and really having any kind of information about the location of the quote is extremely helpful. So we do have examples of that as well that we could put in the chat. Next guideline, there's two more zombie guidelines, and then we move on to ghosts. So this one feels really old to me, but you may remember struggling in the 6th and earlier editions with understanding when to include an issue number in a reference to a journal article. And there were guidelines about when to do that, and they were based on the idea that you had this journal in front of you and that you could understand whether they were paginated. Authors found this a little difficult to implement, and to streamline the guidelines in the 7th, the current edition of APA style, references to journal articles just always include that issue number. If it has one, just put it in the reference. So usually you can find that issue number and other information about the article either in the footer of the article, in the header of the article. Maybe you have to go back to the table of contents, or if you've retrieved the article from a database, you can find it in a database record. Usually you can find the information. If you cannot find the information, it just may not have an issue number, you can also leave it out. And finally, our last zombie here is running heads. So running heads are the text at the top of an article that helps the reader see at a glance which article this page is from. In this case, it's emotional music recognition and resonance at the top. And it's helpful if you're printing, if you're flipping through a printed journal and trying to find an article, or if you have, maybe you're online, but you do have like 10 articles open and you just want to quickly get back to one or another. So the running head is still required in professional manuscripts, and in earlier editions of the publication manual, there was no distinction between a student paper and a professional paper in terms of this guideline and some others. So, but now with student papers, the running head is not required. So, like Samantha said, if you're a teacher and you would like your students to understand how to format the running head, you can still point them to the examples that we have for professional manuscripts, but our student paper examples do not include the running head. And with that, we're off to ghost guidelines with Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Tim. So we are going to now talk about ghost guidelines. So let's begin with identifying what that means. So what we mean here are ideas that have never been APA style guidelines. And I know technically a ghost is something that used to be alive and now it's not anymore, but we're not going to worry about that. Right here, we're thinking about something that has never been, but people think that it has been. So these are common myths and misconceptions, and they come from many different places. Sometimes it's that teachers or people in the community have their own guidelines, which is fine, but then people think that those are official APA guidelines. And that can get murky when they contradict each other. If you have, two people saying, do it this way, and these people over here say, do it this way, and those contradict, that can be a frustrating experience when in fact, both of those, statements were coming from people that weren't us. Additionally, there can be confusion coming from people confusing APA style with other writing styles. For example, there's AP writing style, which is for the Associated Press, which is used in journalism. And like the name of it is even so similar to the name of our writing style that can trip people up. Like, for example, APA style has a serial comma, the comma before and in a list of 3 or more items, whereas AP style doesn't have that. And so remembering exactly which writing style the guidelines go with is definitely key. And last, some of the ghost guidelines happen because of overgeneralizations, that maybe there was something very specific and then people try to extrapolate that when it's not necessarily extrapolatable. So let's dig in to some examples. So the first ghost that we'll talk about is that first and second person pronouns are not allowed, when in fact it is okay to say I and you in APA style papers. If you're referring to yourself, use the pronoun I to refer to yourself. If you're working on a group project, so there's co-authors, then you would use the pronoun we to refer to the work that you and your co-authors did. If you're speaking directly to your audience, you should just say you, because that's what you mean. Something that we commonly see is people referring to themselves in the third person. So they might say something like, the author analyzed 100 studies for the meta-analysis. But what they mean is that they did that work of the meta-analysis. And so you would want to say, I analyzed 100 studies for the meta-analysis in your work. Related to this is to avoid the editorial we. This is also called like the royal we, which is referring to you, a singular person in the plural. And people often use that when they want to make a general statement. Like they might be like, we all have hopes and dreams. Well, what do you mean by we? You should think and try to choose a more precise noun to be clear about exactly the population that you're talking about. Like, do you really mean all people, or do you mean maybe a more specific subset of people? Maybe students or people of particular ages or people of a particular profession would be the group that you're actually talking about. So depending on the assignment, pronouns might not come up at all, but if it's something more personal, like say a response paper or a reaction paper, then using those first person pronouns is vital. We have 2 posts on our blog, one of which was just published today about first and second person pronouns, and we'll be sharing those with you. The next ghost guideline is about the use of footnote citations instead of author date citations in the text. So since its origin in 1929, APA style has always used in-text citations, never footnote or endnote citations. Rather, other writing styles use footnote and endnote citations. So for example, on screen, we have a reference page from the JAMA Network Open Journal, which is a medical journal. They use endnote citations. And so like in the legal field and the medical field, endnote and footnote citations are more common. In APA style, you're going to want to use author date citations. You can use footnotes in APA style. You can have content footnotes or copyright footnotes. but those are different than putting your citations in footnotes. So when it's APA style, you want in-text citations. The next GHOST guideline is the idea that research can't be older than, say, 5 to 10 years. Rather, we don't have any rules about source age. The appropriate age of your source is going to depend on the context of the use. So if you're providing historical background about a topic, your sources might be old. And that's okay, because the point is that you're saying, here's the origin of this subject area. You know, if it was first explored in the 1950s, then your references might be from the 1950s. However, often APA style is being used in social sciences. And as we know, science progresses. And so it's also important to present the newest, most current information available to your readers. And so, yes, you do want to use newer sources when you are presenting current information. Additionally, with this, we do hear from instructors who do have guidelines about source age. They might tell their students your references need to be from within the last 5 years. And that's cool. If you have that instruction, then that's what you should do. But as far as APA is concerned, any source is potentially on the table, no matter when it was published. Additionally, a GHOST guideline is that we have set formats for CVs, curriculum vitae, for resumes, tables of contents, dissertations and theses, and PowerPoint presentations. We don't have set formats for these. However, many APA style principles still apply to these kinds of works. You still got to be concise. You still should be clear and use inclusive language. You should use legible fonts so that your readers can actually read your content. If you're, like say you're doing your resume and you're doing the bullets of your job duties, you can list those in parallel structure so that it's easier and easier to read for the person who's looking at your resume. And with that said, when you're creating these other kinds of documentation, you can use existing tools and templates that are out there in the world. So if you see like a PowerPoint presentation template that you really like, you can use that. Like that's what we did for this presentation. And likewise, if you're creating a table of contents for your dissertation, you can use the built-in table of contents tool in your word processing software to just generate it for you. And the advantages of doing it this way is that the pre-existing tools are going to create more accessible documents for people. So like the structure is set up correctly internally rather than you doing it manually by hand. So takeaway here is lots of APA style principles apply to these other kinds of works, but there's not like a set format that every PowerPoint presentation has to use, you know, this particular format. Another common GHOST guideline is that no full names are allowed in the text, and that is true in parenthetical citations. So in parenthetical citations, you will have written your sentence and then you put the source inside of parentheses. If you're doing that, just put the surname of the author in parentheses. However, it's okay to put the full name or like the first name in the narrative citation or in your regular text if you have a reason. And some of the reasons those might be are to maybe highlight someone's career. Say you're talking about like a famous scientist, you're talking about Carl Rogers or Stanley Milgram, like you can put their whole name in there. Maybe you're talking about a famous person, or maybe you're distinguishing famous people. So here, this is a photograph of Sigmund Freud with his daughter, Anna Freud. And Anna was also a prominent, important psychoanalyst who published books on similar topics to her father. So if you're talking about, especially if you were talking about both of them, you would want to say that like Anna Freud did this and Sigmund Freud explored that, so that readers know which person that you are talking about. Another ghost guideline is that we are specifying what are acceptable sources. We don't have any rules about that. Similar to the guideline, the ghost guideline about source age, like anything is possibly on the table. The legitimacy of the source is going to depend on the context of the use. Why are you using this source? And do you have a good reason for it? And that tells you whether it's a good choice or not. For example, sometimes journal articles get retracted, where like they published it and then something happens and the journal editor says, we shouldn't have published that. We're going to retract it. The thing is, it doesn't disappear from the record when it does that. You can see on screen the one that has retracted across it, like it's still available. And so, for example, maybe you're writing a paper and you're talking about ethics in publication, and you can discuss how maybe certain authors fabricated data and then had their article retracted. You would be able to refer to that source in that context because it makes sense. You wouldn't want to use a retracted source to like bolster your claims, because like the whole point of the retraction is that you shouldn't be doing that. So just looking at the context is key. Likewise, we provide formats if you want to cite Wikipedia or like wiki articles. The context there would be, why are you citing Wikipedia? Are you talking about how information is shared online? Are you talking about like use of plain language? There could be lots of reasons. Like instructors might tell their students, don't cite Wikipedia because they don't want them to just regurgitate an encyclopedia article for their paper. And like, that's a reason not to use Wikipedia, but that would be within the context of the classroom assignment that you would know whether that was allowed or not. Likewise, newspapers, magazines, blogs, social media like TikTok, YouTube, all of those are potential good sources. Sometimes news breaks on social media. You could be writing a paper about social media and want to cite things that are on there. And so you just need to focus on what's the context. And then if you're writing in a classroom environment, looking at whatever guidelines the instructor has. And if you are the instructor, being clear with your students about what your expectations are for the kinds of sources that your students should be using. I think the last ghost guideline here is the idea that APA style is getting updated every year or all the time. And as you saw earlier when Samantha was talking, we really only update our editions every like 7 to 10 years. The most recent current edition, 7th edition, was published in fall 2019. And in between editions, not that much changes. For example, like I think APA changed the permissions policy if you're like reproducing tables and figures in a work that's being published with APA, but all the information for that is all on the website. And like within our publication manual, some of the links in the reference examples are like dead and broken. And so like we fixed the links when we printed new versions. But like big wholesale giant changes aren't happening in between. So you can settle in and, you know, get used to the way the guidelines are, and then also like share your feedback with us about what you think of them, because we want you to be happy and to make your life easier. So I'm going to end this part of the presentation with some ideas about how you can help students with APA style. We recommend that you recommend authoritative sources. There's lots of information about APA style out on the internet, out on the world, and some of it comes from APA, from the American Psychological Association. That's us. And we want you to use our stuff. The publication manual is the style manual that has everything in it for professionals. The concise guide to APA style includes a subset of content that from the publication manual and is specifically geared towards students. So like it doesn't talk about getting your paper published because you're not publishing a paper if you're, in a, entry-level class writing a response paper. And then also we really recommend the APA style website, which you can reach at apastyle.org. And tons of our guidelines are available on the website for free, and you can use the search bar and search for the thing that you're looking for, and it makes it really easy to find. We also have an awesome product called the Mastering APA Style Student Workbook. This is going to teach you APA style through doing it. So it's all online. We used to have a paper workbook, but that is no more. It's all online, and it teaches you APA style through applied practice. So there's questions, and to know the answer, you have to go look up the answer in the manual. And over time, in doing that, you start remembering what the answers are. And you also learn how to use a reference book, which is sometimes not a skill that everybody is born knowing how to do. If you're a teacher and you're using this book, you can use it with your class and assign content to them through your LMS. And you can also monitor your students' learning and progress through a tool called the Learning Dashboard. So there's lots of really cool tools if you're an instructor. And additionally, this product can be used by anyone, by just an individual. If you're interested in this product specifically, check out the QR code on the screen, scan it if you're interested in a trial. That is an educator trial if you're a teacher who wants to use it in your classroom. We also recommend using our instructional aids available on the APA Style website. The instructional aids include tutorials and webinars like this one, our handouts and guides, which are free for you to use in your class, and sample papers. There's sample papers that are annotated that like explain what all of the different parts are, and there's sample papers for different kinds of research. Like there's one for qualitative research, for quantitative research. So there's lots of options there. And if you are looking through and you don't see something that you would want, let us know, because maybe we can make it and put it on the website and then you can use it. Likewise, if you have a handout that you've made that you think is really good, let us know, and maybe we'll put it on the website and publish it and give you credit so that everyone can benefit from these free resources. So now we are going to have a Q&A time. I see many questions have been accumulating, and Samantha is going to be our moderator as we spend our last 10 minutes or so taking your questions.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. And you probably didn't notice because you were presenting, but the first person versus third person ghost guidelines got a flurry of controversy going in the chat. So can you talk a little bit about two aspects? One, can an instructor or a discipline decide that they don't like first person and they want people to use third person? And then could you provide additional information on why we kind of made that, or why don't we specify that students cannot use the first person?
Great. So I didn't see it because I was indeed presenting, but so you could, yes, you could say, I want you students to call yourselves the author. You could do that, but I wouldn't recommend that you do that because it's not as clear. If it's you and you're speaking for yourself, you should just say it. You should just say I or we. And I think that what it's coming from is clear communication. I've noticed that a lot of science writing is really dense and it's hard to understand, especially if you're new or like maybe it's in English and English isn't your first language. It can be rough trying to figure out what the authors are saying. And we really want to promote the idea that you should just say it, just say what you mean. Like, your writing can be more similar to how you talk. And if you were talking about yourself, you would use a first person pronoun to refer to yourself. Certainly there's the potential for overuse, and that would be more under the umbrella of like not so good writing. But that, I think that summarizes sort of our take on it. Does that answer what you think the question was?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see that this is still something that people have varying opinions on, and that's absolutely okay. If you as an instructor want your students to print out all of their papers on purple paper, you can make that rule.
Yeah.
And that's going to come first. But I do, from our standpoint, it really is, it does seem more simple, especially for those students who might be, not speaking English as a first language and things like that. But we understand that everybody has their own opinion, and your opinion comes first when it comes to what you assign specifically for your students. And then, go ahead,
Sorry,
Tim, did you have something
just
to
to
add?
add that, and sorry, just to add that when we get questions from students, that is always part of our response. Like, do what your instructor asks first. If they didn't give you guidelines, here's what our guidelines are. But yeah, we support instructors' variations.
Yeah, one example, if you're thinking, do real scientists use the first person? They do. If you look in published journal articles for like comments and replies, that is a case where you'll see first person used by real scientists in published contexts, because they will be like, I read so-and-so's article and I disagree with them because, and then, that's the point of the article. So that's an example of it being used in the real professional world as well.
Great. We also had many questions, which is not completely unexpected, about AI. There are a couple of different ones. First, we saw, do we recommend any sort of AI detection software? And then how do you cite AI? So first of all, in terms of AI detection software, that's not something that APA style really has an opinion on. We are not here to kind of police use of AI or things like that. However, we do have some guidance on how to cite AI, which you can find in on our blog. And maybe somebody has, yep, Tim put the link in the chat. So we really believe that there is a legitimate way to use pretty much any tool that's out there. There's a reason, you might be writing about AI or something like that. So you may want to cite it, and here's the information on how to do it.
Yeah, I would add, additionally, when people ask, how do I cite AI? Sometimes that's not actually the question that they mean. Sometimes they mean, I asked ChatGPT to write my paper for me. Can I do that? And like, the answer is probably no. That would be unethical. You should not get the computer to write your paper for you. But like, that's different than citing it, right? And so the goal is transparency, being honest with others about the tools that you used. For example, there's some guidelines if you're publishing with APA journals and you used AI to help you, there's like sort of an idea for how you would state that to let others know that you did that. And likewise, like, AI can't be credited as an author of a paper. So like, they've decided that that's not something that is allowed or makes sense. And so when this topic comes up, I would be more specific about what you really mean, what's really happening, before just wholesale being like AI is a no or AI is a yes.
Absolutely. Great. Another question we had is, how would you cite an author name that has a name that's not in English? So, for example, it might use a Korean alphabet. How would you do that citation?
So in that case, it would be transliterated. So there are often standard ways to render non-Roman alphabets in the Roman alphabet, and you could follow one of those systems to do that.
Awesome.
I'm just going to put the section number. It's section 9.38 in the publication manual.
Mhm.
Great. We also have a question. I have students who want to follow the letter of the law for formatting, but don't understand the style part of APA writing. Do we have any resources to share on this?
So we were just talking about this recently. The 7th edition refers to guidelines for the most part. If you count it up, you'll see way more guidelines than rules. Rules we talk about, like grammar rules that are beyond us, but everything else we consider like the best case scenario for for formatting and other things. But we understand that variations are sometimes needed. So we do try to just refer to guidelines as one way to have that message. And I think that comes across in a lot of our instructional aids, but I don't think we have that could be an interesting blog post. Chelsea, am I forgetting anything we've written about that?
I don't think so.
Great, thank you. Another question is for adults just starting with APA, what is the best or most impactful place to begin developmentally? I do not want to overwhelm, but I want to strategically add to students' APA toolkit.
Love it. Such a good question. We are actually developing a new page on our website that's going to be up in probably like the next couple of weeks. APA style for beginners, for exactly this kind of situation. And it's going to be like a curated list of where to start from information that's on our website. If you are interested in really diving into APA style from the beginning, I really recommend our free tutorial that is available through our instructional aids section of the website. I'm sure someone can put a link in the chat for you all. That the tutorial covers APA style from beginning to end and will give you a great overview. Additionally, the Mastering APA Style student workbook will definitely teach you all the APA style that you could possibly want to know. And the great thing about the workbook is that you can do the sections that are of interest to you. You don't have to do the whole thing. Like if you wanted to just focus on in-text citations and references, there's specific modules about those topics, and you could just focus on those. Because like as Samantha mentioned earlier, looking at paper format and citations and references and inclusive language, those three areas are really pivotal to APA style. So make sure that you focus on those at the beginning.
Great. So we just have time for one more question. And we know there are tons of questions coming in. I think we have 95 open questions. So we will get back to you by email if we did not answer your question. You can also always, correspond with us via our social media channels. Maybe you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, something like that. And we have an email address, which is styleexpert@apa.org. Our last question is from a librarian who wants to know, can we put the APA guides in PDF on our library web pages? So the guides that we shared with you today are absolutely for you guys to use wherever you'd like. You can print them out, hand them out to your students. You can link to them from your library webpage, or you can link from, Canvas or Blackboard. We do recommend that you put in the links instead of the PDF, just in case something changes. That way, you know, you're always going to have kind of the up-to-date information. If we have to, you know, make a quick change, we can do that. Chelsea or Tim, do you have anything to add?
No.
No, I
Thank
think
you.
that's great. Linking is key, because then you're making sure you have the most up-to-date version available for you and your students to use.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. And again, if we did not get to your question, we will be answering them over the next couple of days and sending you an email. So thank you all so much for your time. It was great to talk to you all. And